Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this instructional design engagement series. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce a dear friend and mentor, the distinguished Professor Laura Czerniewicz from UCT. Back in 2009, when I first took up my position at the newly established Teaching and Learning Office, I invited Laura to come to UKZN to present a seminar, which she did. It was titled, What Have Higher Education? Has something happened? Are we still there? Yeah, okay. Yes, so the seminar was titled Higher Education in South Africa, What Have ICTs Got to Do with It? And she presented a wonderful seminar on international trends and institutional responses. This was a watershed seminar for me because it enabled me to acquire a new digital lexicon, a new vocabulary that was to shape my thinking and my strategy in the years ahead. Back then, you will recall the buzzwords were, we must embrace technology. And you, Laura, cautioned against slavish adoption of technology. You argued instead that we should engage with technology with all its promises and perils. You'll be pleased, Laura, to know that it was through your influence that we now have a dedicated unit for technology-enhanced learning at UKZN called UTLO. So, ladies and gentlemen, after almost 15 years since that seminar, Laura continues to be one of the most influential scholars on technology in education. And today, we have the privilege of listening to Laura engage with the complexities, opportunities, and challenges presented by the integration of technologies in higher education. She will explore some of the trends in the new era of digitization. She will also explore what the new role of universities is in this post-digital environment. And in particular, and this is what her particular area of focus, she will argue or explore how inequalities are cultivated in various teaching and learning modes that rely on a digital future. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Laura Czerniewicz, a professor at the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at the University of Cape Town, where she was also its founding director. She worked for many decades in education, including as academic researcher, strategist, advocate, teacher trainer, and educational publisher. But as I said, more importantly, Laura has devoted her intellectual labor to alerting the academic community to the challenges of equity and digital inequality. These have permeated her research interests, which focus on the changing nature of higher education in a post-digital society and new forms of teaching and learning provision. Welcome again, Laura. Privileged to have you back with us. And I now hand you back to Setu, who will facilitate the session. Back to you, Setu.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you, Prof. Laura, for honoring us with your presence today. Very much appreciated. As the colleagues will know, that this serves as one of what we hope will be many sessions engaging with the various and complex mixture of forces at play within the digital transformation currently sweeping higher education. And with this, we hope to raise institutional awareness of not only the implications and consequences of digital transformation across the board within learning environments, but also to spark further deliberations in the process of integrating instructional design within UKZN. We hope this is one of many. And Prof Laura has kindly shared resources, which I have shared into the chat box. I've shared it as a SharePoint link, which is a folder containing all the documentation, as well as single PDF files. So please feel free to engage and share as widely as you feel. Prof Laura, once again, thank you very much for your time and your presence. It is incredibly appreciated. I will now hand over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you both of you for your kind words. I remember that talk so well, Ravi. It's fascinating because some of these discussions have been going on for a long time, and the pandemic has really been a catalyst, as we'll, I'm sure we'll talk. But I just want to say that I've also been keeping a very interested eye on the good work that you've been doing at UKZN in both practice and scholarship. And although you've asked me to talk today, and so I'm hoping to provoke some discussion, I'm also really looking forward to some conversation. And I hope we're going to manage that. Okay, so you gave me an incredibly big brief, Setu. Talk about post-digital futures in universities and talk about inequality. I mean, these are such big issues to talk about. And what I'm going to do is quite a broad sweep. And I know that you're planning to have many more conversations. So really touch on what I think are the current issues of the day. Some of them, I'm afraid to say, resonate with the ones in the past, and then we've got a whole lot of new ones. So this is what you've asked me to cover, and I'll do my best in a short period of time. Right. Okay, just before I start talking about technology and about the digital, I just want to clarify some terms. When I talk about technology, I imagine 4 types of technology. So the first type is analog, and analog is non-digital. It can be electronic, so a digital, an overhead projector, for example, is analog, but it's also electronic. And then by digital, I mean anything that has a microprocessor with binary numerical systems representing data. But digital is pre-network digital. So for example, standalone computers, CD-ROMs, DVDs, and so on, those are all digital. They all represent data, but they are one-to-one or one-to-many. So I don't know if any of you, well, you probably, I don't know how old my audience is, but when I was at school, there used to be these things called language laboratories, where you basically spoke to a computer to learn a foreign language. That's pre-network digital. Then network digital is what we generally mean when we talk about the digital. And this is connected, connectivity, social, many to many, and their access is essential. And then the whole discourse of the 4th industrial revolution is really around smart technology. So self-monitoring, analysis, and reporting technology. So there we're talking about AI, automation, and this is where it's possible to interact and share and shape and inform and modify user behavior. This is going to be a thread through everything we talk about today. So the first thing I want to say is that it is a post-digital world. And it was interesting that Setu actually used that term in what she spoke to me about, because post-digital actually means that it's pretty much impossible to be disconnected. And of course, we all will go, but we have serious digital divides. We have et cetera, and that's all true, except that this picture that I'm showing here is a SASAQ in a rural area. And for people to get grants, they are digitally connected. They have smart cards. So as soon as you hear the word smart, you need to know, in fact, in my view, you need to be suspicious, because smart means data that can be used for a whole range of purposes. So even people who are ostensibly completely disconnected are in fact connected and are part of digital systems. So that's really the starting point that I want to say a little bit about today. And what goes with that is that everything is datafied. There was a great article in New Frame, which is worth looking at, where I took their picture from there. But by datafied, I mean that every aspect of behavior can be captured, monitored, used, owned, utilized, used to be influenced in a whole range of ways. So we've moved a long way in the last 15 years to the point where everything's datafied. And this is something that many people are commenting on. This has been discussed since before COVID. This has been, so the wonderful intellectual, extraordinary public intellectual, Achille Mbembe, speaks about our mind and psychic life have become the main raw material which digital capitalism aims at capturing and commodifying. So note that our mind, the notion that the mind is something invisible and hidden, and he's pointing out this is actually becoming raw material for capturing and commodification. And the wonderful literary author and scholar, Zadie Smith, also points out that there's no choice. She says you go through every website saying yes, because you can't possibly read 50,000 pages of small print. But every time you say yes, you're submitting to a system which makes you manifestly unfree. It steals data from you every second of your life. These are profound observations with very serious consequences. And in 2017, a book was published which put a language to some of these observations, which is the language of platform capitalism. And here, the concept is that platforms provide a central model for extracting data as raw material to be used in various ways. So data is built into their DNA. And the important thing about platforms is they provide an infrastructure. It's an infrastructure that enables goods and services to be built on top. That infrastructure demands more users to gain network effects. It makes storage and recording very simple, and it tends to monopoly. So let me rather give some examples. The obvious ones are Facebook, Airbnb, Uber, anything where the platform is the intermediary and everything works through that intermedium. So we are actually seeing a new form of capitalism. The other person who's been hugely influential in this post-digital sphere in terms of thinking is Shoshana Zuboff, who talks about surveillance capitalism. And that term has really infiltrated the discourse, I think. And she describes as surveillance capitalism as a new economic logic that predicts and modifies human behavior as a means to produce revenue and market control. Those two words are really important, and they are what takes the description beyond platform capitalism, because predict and modify are the words. The obvious example that comes to mind is the Trump elections, where Facebook played a significant role that has since been shown to be the case in Trump's election through the modification of user behavior using user data. This kind of capitalism has been also described as a new form of colonization, and it's something I've written about elsewhere, where it's extractive and it's extracting data. So Zuboff talks about how data is computed and packaged as prediction products and sold into behavioral futures markets. Business customers with a commercial interest in knowing what we'll do now, sooner and later. So Surveillance Capitalism is a really fat book, but if you watch some of her talks, she's very accessible and explains some of these concepts that sound quite dense, but are really not that dense. And I know you're thinking, hang on a second, this is an instructional design opening talk. Why why is all this language being articulated and expressed? And I think what's happened is that these surveillance practices have been drawn into the post-pandemic university. And it's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but we wrote a paper, a group of colleagues and I, in a few places where we spelt out how these kinds of practices, how this kind of language, how these kinds of activities have entered the university. Because what happened during the pandemic, as we all know, is that everyone went online to the best of their ability, very unequally, but they went online using all those different kinds of technologies. The whole sector was moved into the digital space, willy-nilly, unwillingly. And the other thing that happened at exactly the same time was that the privatization of the sector happened at the same time. So a whole range of new relationships with vendors and providers, including Microsoft Teams and Zoom, which we are using right now. Those kind of relationships also entered the higher education ecosystem and the teaching and learning ecosystem. So what we did in this paper is we described and thought through the way these kinds of practices have entered universities and have entered teaching and learning spaces, ranging from students, examples, some of which are from elsewhere, of students going through university websites being tracked, to the online proctoring, tension and debate, to the debates around Turnitin, where students are actually giving their content to the company who then sells it on. So Turnitin was bought a couple of years ago for, was it 1.3 billion? I forget the actual number, something extraordinary with data that students had given. So the question of data sovereignty, of who owns student data and academics data, is a huge issue, and it goes beyond POPIA, because some people will talk about the Privacy Act, and the Privacy Act is about content, whereas this is about clicks, likes, linkages, and so on. This is something we can talk more about because it speaks to a range of issues around the metrification of universities, the way that measuring has become the route to go rather than relationships of trust, notions of what learning actually comprises. But it's a critical moment for thinking about those kinds of things. Okay, then let's just talk very briefly about inequality. This is something I think we're all really familiar with, and unfortunately in South Africa, we're particularly familiar with. It's interesting to note, though, that in the US, for example, almost 10 years ago, Obama was talking about inequality as the defining challenge of our age. So it's certainly not only a local consideration. We have the unfortunate position of having one of the worst Gini coefficients in the world, but it's a global issue at the moment. And linked to that is the UN Secretary General talking about digital inequality being one of the wickedest policy problems. I think most people are fairly familiar with the idea of the digital divide, of first level digital divides, which is not simply, that's the wrong word, having access. And that's something we saw a lot of during the pandemic, where universities were giving students laptops or tablets or actual access, sending data. The state arranged for telecommunications companies to have free data available through mobile devices. So that's the first level of the digital divide. The second level of the digital divide is, of course, about use. And here, this is a really important issue because as the world becomes more datafied, the question of what kind of digital skills are needed to negotiate the use of the internet goes way beyond a narrow notion of computer literacy. And then the third level of the digital divide, which has been gaining more attention, is the benefits, the actual social and tangible benefits. And here economists have been doing really interesting work around not simply in education, but in agriculture and health and so on, around inequalities through digital inequalities and investment in the social realm and beyond the notion of data literacies. And it brings us to an idea of a digital inequality paradox, which is that the more one enables or provides equality and equity through the provision of various devices or skills, the more the forms of inequalities morph into more complex and more difficult inequalities. And so it's an impossible, it's not a linear route to follow where something is achieved. There's always some kind of morphing into something different. And then, of course, along came COVID. So a lot of what I'm talking about was prior to university, to the pandemic. We had a situation of which was essentially a perfect storm. The situation with platformization of surveillance capitalism, of digitalization, of metrification, and then a pandemic, with everything that happened with the pandemic. And I really would like to take a moment to observe that it's been tough. There's this kind of sense of engagement and moving forward, but it's been really, really difficult. And for South African society and for South African universities which have faced so many challenges and such difficult times and such poverty and such trauma, this has been a really, really difficult period. And I saw earlier, I can't see now because I've got a full screen, but I saw that there's something like 44 participants in this event. And I just think that's amazing, because people, I think one starting point is that everyone's absolutely exhausted. And now we are asking people to engage and move forward and be resilient and grapple with these things even more. And it's a big ask, and it's really kudos to everyone for being here at all. Okay, so I'm mindful that you don't want me to be completely depressing and despairing. And I'm not one of those people who thinks that there's an opportunity in every crisis, and that saying that I really don't like, I must say. You know, the crisis is a great opportunity, but I do like this quote from Leonard Cohen, who says there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. And some of you might remember that song. So I would like to just make a couple of observations before opening this up for discussion. And that is that COVID wasn't an opportunity, but what it did do in terms of teaching and learning, as my wonderful colleague Shanali Govender says, COVID took classrooms and made them strange again. What happened in the process, especially after that first beginning phase, is that people were forced in the process of moving to blended online to think about space differently, to think about where students' bodies are located. And we know that they are located very, very differently. And people had to rethink curriculum, because the other thing, of course, that was happening at the same time is that there's been a parallel thread around decolonization, which also had to be brought into this discussion. And certainly COVID has rethought time, the notion of synchronous, of how things normally work, and every person in the same place in the same time simply was thrown out the window. So time has been rethought. And in the process, there's been a lot of rethinking about what learning actually involves. One of the ironies is that online makes visible and explicit both the planning of the online, but the recording of the online, the fact that there are records, there are tracks, and these can be advantageous. And the point I think I would like to emphasizing today is that inequality became hyper visible. One of the things that on-campus teaching can do is it can ameliorate and hide some of the inequalities in student populations. You can provide residence rooms, you can provide laboratories. And the differences in background and the differences in cultural capital can be more opaque. During the pandemic, inequality became hyper visible. And as one of my colleagues said, once that has been seen, it can't be unseen. This is just showing you a literature review that was done of studies at the beginning of the pandemic. And these are global studies, what people were writing about and noticing. And what I think is striking is globally, the digital divide and vast educational socioeconomic inequities was high up on what was being observed all over the world. And that has to be a good thing from the point of view of educators. Not that inequality exists, but that it has to be paid attention to. The other thing I also think is interesting that I'm going to return to is this idea of flexibility and design. Through attention being paid to inequality, we have seen a lot of attention paid to designing for inequality. And these are some of the links that I've included. I'm sure there are many more. A lot of universities created resources for themselves. So equity by design, low tech remote teaching principles, mobile first, low bandwidth teaching and learning, best practices for synchronous and asynchronous. When my student has no internet, what's great about these resources is they're from everywhere. If I recall correctly, the last one is from the US. This attention and this thinking about design in this way is a catalyst for a change in design in ways that we have known for a long time are needed. And it's definitely something we want to hang on to. The other thing is an interesting shift towards universal design for learning. The universal, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but universal design for learning has rose out of the disabilities sphere. And it's really about multiplicities of designs for means of engagement, for means of representation, and for means of action and expression. And it's a clearly articulated framework that has it's pragmatic, it's practical, and it's how to actually build for and link to learning design in ways that are now being also articulated in social justice ways. And that's something that I think for those of us who are concerned about inequality, we can certainly take that forward. And then the last major area that is certainly coming to everyone's attention is this question of digital capabilities and much more sophisticated notions of digital capabilities from digital identity management. So I started the talking about IDs and smart IDs. Identity management is around online footprints. It's around digital well-being with everything that goes with it. All educators have stories about digital well-being and not well-being, cyberbullying and the like, to forms of digital communication, collaboration, participation, creation. So a much more sophisticated notion of what digital capabilities are. And there's that key idea of data literacy, data sovereignty, data ownership. Who reads the fine print every time something pops up and says, do you agree to? I mean, how many people actually do that? I'm sure I'm one of the only people who does, and that's because I have a research interest in it. So this very, very sophisticated notion of what's needed for digital capabilities is something that is receiving so much more attention. Okay, I'm going to end now because I really want to open this up for discussion, and I'm sure that you have a lot to contribute to. By ending on a note of concern about risks, because my concern is that these issues and trends that I've been pointing to risk playing out unevenly and exacerbating and deepening divides. So these divides are at the micro, meso, and macro level. So one of the big concerns as a sector is that university systems become further stratified. We know that some universities went online immediately, they were prepared, they had resources, they were able to be adaptive and speedy. We know that some universities went online very late. So this is a real concern for the South African sector. And we know that there's unequal terms of engagement in terms of economic, cultural, and social capital, both at the level of individuals and at the level of institutions. And digital and data literacies are becoming much more complex. And there's a real risk that at the student level, it will be those with the kinds of sophisticated cultural capital who will be able to negotiate this post-digital world much more than others. And I'm going to stop sharing because my screen is doing something strange. Okay, so that's my kind of provocation, Setu and Ravi. And I see there's things in the chat, and I'm so looking forward to questions and comments.
Oh, thank you so much, Prof. You've given us much to think about. I think moving all the way from understanding the forces, or one could use that word, it sounds a little bit, well, it is kind of sinister, the acting out of capitalist forces on higher education, the increasing commercialization of the space and how it limits to a certain extent the focus on the human and social exercise of learning. I'll just touch here and there on some other issues that you raised. The issue of the levels of digital divide and the need to be cognizant of how inequality plays out in different forms within what one would seem to be a singular exercise, as well as how in the future that there are, with the increasing integration of digital tools within universities, there is more chances of stratification, but also the complexity of the kind of skills required to maneuver within it and maintain the focus of education. Thank you very much, Prof. I think I'll be looking into the cost of connection. I think that should be a very interesting book. Siemens tends to look at connectivism in a very positive sense, which is where I tend to fall into. But of course, there is more room to engage. Colleagues, please feel free to raise your hands should you have any comments or questions for Prof Laura in relation to her talk. We are looking forward to engage. Okay, Mukondi, please go right ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mukondi.
Yes, I was still unmuting. Hi, Prof. Thank you for that presentation. I did come in a bit late, so sorry about that to everyone. But I did catch a bit of what you were talking about, with particular interest to, you mentioned in passing decolonization, that it was one of the big topics or discussions that was happening. And yeah, I have engaged much with the topic, you know, from, you know, another institution that I studied at. I was very active in that space, you know, as a student and so on. And one of the things that, of course, were quite a challenge was, of course, defining what does decolonization mean within higher education? What would it look like in a practical sense? And so I was wondering, within this context of the digital transformation and e-learning, what is your understanding of, you know, first of all, decolonization as a concept itself, and also how it would fit into present discussion on digital transformation?
Great question. I'm just wondering if there are any other questions before I answer.
Any other questions from colleagues? Please feel free to raise your hand. I'll give you the floor to speak. Okay, Prof, none is yet. Perhaps we can engage with Mukondi's question.
Okay, I'm just actually looking for something I want to show you. Because I think it's such an interesting question. I'm just trying to find something that I can put on the screen. So Mkondi, I'm not an expert in decolonization in what one might call the traditional sense of the word. When I talk about decolonization, I'm talking about data extraction and as a new form of colonization. And I just want to show you something that I have written about this, which I can point you to. So if you think of Maldonado Torres's notion of decolonization, he talks about coloniality as long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but defines culture, labor, and knowledge production beyond colonial administration. So I'm talking about a way of thinking where people accept extractions, and in the traditional notion of extraction, it was human labor that was extracted. And my argument is that it is now human experience that is being extracted. So in the same way that historically labor was extracted for the goals of profit making and markets, now human experience is extracted for the goals of profit making and markets. So if you look at Zuboff's work, the first part is understanding how these extractive business models are designed to use user experience for profit. And in order to decolonize, one has to find ways of resisting and refusing that kind of decolonization. And that's what we were talking about in our paper on surveillance practices, which Setu has included. I'm going to link you to something I've written about on this so that we don't take up all the time, because I know that you want to talk more about teaching and learning. Okay.
While you share that, Prof.
Okay, here it is. So I've put it in there, and it's a really, really important issue. And I think the notion of data coloniality is pushing that question very strongly. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Prof. We also have a question from Radilwe, in which she thanks you for your talk, and asks in relation to what you said in terms of preparation by universities to go online. She asks, do you think the teachers were prepared to teach online? And what ways can we equip teachers and lecturers to provide quality teaching now that we find ourselves online?
Well, I mean, there's a short answer and a long answer to that, isn't that so? I mean, of course, nobody was prepared to ready for teaching online anywhere, not here and not elsewhere in the world either. And I think that's one of the reasons that the term emergency remote teaching came into existence, because in fact, what most teaching was not online teaching. Formal, serious, proper online teaching requires time, preparation, design, a whole range of skills that were simply not in existence in most places. And in order to do that, you need a commitment, you need regulatory frameworks, you need capacity. I think it's really interesting that this series of talks that you're providing today focus on instructional design and learning design, because learning design has become probably one of the most sought after and essential skill sets in teaching and learning in higher education, here and everywhere. partly, I think, because there is generally a consensus that blended learning, at least, will be the way of the future. Not necessarily online learning, but blended learning. And that's going to need professional development. And one of the papers that I circulated that I gave Setu is something in a very different order of things from the kind of talk we're having today, which is a paper that I was asked to do for the Department of Higher Education and Training. It's quite a left brain, very specific paper about new forms and trends of types of provision and how they fit into current regulatory frameworks. So Rabi, for example, you will be particularly familiar with the constraints and the constraints largely of the current regulatory frameworks to offer blended and alternative forms of provision. And what the department asked me to do is to look at the current trends and to look at the gaps and to look at what's needed to enable quality blended learning in the future. And so to answer your question about quality, I think this is something that the national department is aware of and is paying attention to, because it's a big issue and it's not going away. There's no going back to how things were. There's no, there is this new normal. There's no, the past is gone. The pre-COVID period of teaching and learning is over.
Thank you for that, Prof. Within your talk, you mentioned universal learning design or universal design for learning, which is something that has very much framed the development of the instructional design strategy within UKZN.
That's great.
Particularly understanding the kind of challenges that around across there are inequalities, geographic and otherwise, but expanding the view on how those inequalities influence what is happening within platforms is something that we are hoping to be incredibly cognizant of as we grow, this sort of view of blended and online learning within the institution. So I think that was very much on cue, Prof, so very much appreciated. Would you believe when we view the issues of disability, for example, how do you believe it would be possible to frame design that is very much inclusive in this form within higher education currently?
I'm not a disability specialist, and fortunately there are a lot of disability specialists. What I have observed, though, is that other countries have regulatory requirements which we don't have, and I think that makes a big difference. So I've experienced being part of events elsewhere where it's simply a given that enablements for visually impaired or hearing impaired or whatever are simply necessary. So we are, I think, very often still at the stage where we're advocating for things that have become policy requirements, and I think that will come, and it'll really make a big difference. But the specifics of how you do that, I would think that would be an entire seminar in its own right. There's a lot of work to be done, and we did in fact we did a MOOC on that. So if I can do some advertising, UCT developed a MOOC with the disability unit, talking about those very issues.
All right. I think thank you very much, Prof. I have what I assume is a question. Yes, it is from Matsepo, who is firstly thanking you for the interesting presentation. And agreeing with you that we are not going back. This is the new normal. And further, given your response on the level of preparedness by most academics for RET, what is your view on how we can approach curriculum redesign for blended learning, and most especially paying attention to these issues of equality or quality specifically that we've raised?
I must say, I'm very happy to comment on everything, but I would love to hear from some of the people here too. So Matsepo, I'd be interested to hear on your views as well. From just on a practical point of view, I don't think there should be separate quality controls and reviews and measures for blended and online learning. I don't think it's a separate thing. There might be unique affordances and so on, but I think that existing quality frameworks need to include these different enablements and affordances. It's actually all learning, you know. To go back to my original point about being a post-digital world, it's going to be really difficult to say we are now in the analog world. We are not in the analog world. No one's in the analog world. In fact, it's almost impossible to be in the analog world. So I think from the point of view of quality, I think all existing quality frameworks at institutional level and nationally should integrate these kinds of measures. And I believe that the National Department is already doing that. But I'd love to hear what you think too.
Any further comments? Thank you, Prof. Any further comments, colleagues, that we can forward to Prof? Or is everyone very shy today? Oh, there we go. Please go ahead, Jasper.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Laura. Good to see you again.
Can't see you though.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, to talk about
Jasper, may I interject for a second, please, Jasper?
Sure.
So, Laura, I mentioned in my introduction that we've been working feverishly trying to prepare UKZN for this digital future that we're speaking about. And about 5 years ago, I invited Jasper Cecil to begin to lay the foundations for what would become UKZN Technology Enhanced Learning Unit. And Jasper's worked very hard at it. And now we have a fully fledged unit of which Jasper is manager. Back to you, Jasper.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the quality issue because, you know, in emergency teaching, what's happened is a lot of academics have just gone onto Zoom and delivered their standard lecture across Zoom, and they think we are now moving towards blended learning or you know, a new way of, so all it is the same delivery just through a different medium. So how do we improve that in terms of quality? I know it takes a great deal of preparedness and a different way of developing and designing your information so that it can go into a blended form. But how do you migrate your academics into this new way of thinking to spend time on designing blended learning teaching? Because I think the standard thing is most people feel that now that they've switched on their Zoom cameras and they delivered 50 lectures, they've now gone into this new era, and it's clearly not so. So that's the kind of question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you're asking the big question, which is how does change happen? And how does professional development happen? And I think there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration. Unfortunately, universities have such a history of working in silos, whereas the kinds of issues you're asking are the kinds of issues all universities are asking. And there's a real opportunity for professional development across the sector. In fact, Portugal has done an amazing job. The Portuguese universities have actually worked together around professional development. And I think that's something we could look to in terms of how we do this. And then, of course, there are the carrots and sticks things. You know, how do we reward these? As long as universities reward research, because what you're actually asking is better teaching. You know, the mode has changed, and we have to adapt to the mode. But you know, how does one reward good teaching in traditional formats? How do you reward good teaching in online modes? These are questions that especially research-focused universities, research-intensive universities, and universities whose governance structures reward research activity are facing. So, you know, it's about the ad hominem promotions, and it's about the incentives, and it's about the, do you require, you know, Ravi, do you require your new staff to get some kind of a qualification in teaching and learning? You know, it's I think a whole range of strategies for addressing these questions, and these are things that all universities are facing. So there's no easy answer to that other than to share the problem and the solution.
Thank you, Prof. Kerry, I hope I'm not butchering your surname, UTLO, writes such important questions about the value of teaching, how policies and structures simply don't truly reward this, regardless of the mode. So I guess touching on the need to reimagine how this reward structure works as it relates not only, I assume, to blended learning, but learning across the board. This is agreed by Mary Ann Good. Are there any other questions or comments, colleagues? None other? Okay then. Prof, would you like to have a final word?
I was hoping Ravi would give us the final word.
Ah, yes.
And what your thoughts are on some of the things I've said and how they resonate.
Yes, no, certainly. Thank you, Laura, for those provocative musings, which we're going to have to engage in. So I was hoping Seto would give you more of a background to this instructional designer domain that we've introduced very recently. So we have the UTLO facility, which is a very sophisticated facility. And the challenge has been, how do you usher academics from traditional practices towards the digital future, which is now inescapable? And we recognize that that transition is very difficult, not just for accomplished academics, but even for emerging academics, particularly because of the phenomenon of, you know, the apprenticeship of observation. In the absence of alternative modes, we all regress into the ways that we are familiar and comfortable with. So we took the conscious decision that we would create this new department within UTLO, the instructional design, which eventually will evolve to become learning design, and capacitate this unit to be able to go out and work with academics. So we have one instructional designer per college and one located in the central office. And they will work as a team in developing, well, of course, they've developed the strategy. Now their challenge is to unfold their plans to partner with academics in adopting blended online hybrid teaching and learning. So once again, we'll be calling on you, Laura, every now and then to look at what we're doing, to critique it, to evaluate it, and to see how we can deliver on our mandate of purposefully re-engineering the university for relevance. And I am very aware of how the traditional university faces obsolescence unless it radically re-envisions itself and its mandate and how it serves the community in a socially just world.
Thank you, Ravi. You know, what you've just described is so spot on. I think your model of taking learning designers into the faculties and locating them in the disciplines is really the way to go. And I think recognizing the central role of learning design is also absolutely the way to go. Setu, I don't know if she's mentioned, maybe she's modest, but she is the author of a chapter in a book that we are putting together on learning design, where we are actually, it's called Learning Design Voices. And it's about experiences and models and approaches of learning designers and the work that they do. And I think it's a fantastic, it's an international collaboration. And I think it's actually putting learning design at the heart of change and transition and of pedagogy for these new kinds of universities. So I think that's wonderful. And I hope that some of the things that I've pointed to have helped clarify rather than overwhelm, because this is actually such a complicated and complex space. And if we don't pay attention to them, I fear that we're going to find ourselves entrenching inequalities in ways we certainly don't want to do. So that's really what I've tried to do today, is alert us to some of these complexities.
And we certainly appreciate that, Prof. I think you've given us much to consider, much to garner as we move forward with these engagements, but not only that, even in our actual development of these implementation plans across colleges is something that I hope colleagues within the colleges also sort of wrangle with as we try and determine the exact format in which this would be taking place within the institution. I think incredibly important concepts have been discussed today. Colleagues, as you know, I will certainly be sharing both of the recording of today, but as well as the supplemental resources that Prof Laura has kindly shared prior to this talk with everyone. I would hope that in our next session, I think we had an incredibly good attendance this session around. I would hope next time we have even more. As we build slowly our understanding of the value of integrating far more than just the technical aspects into the blended learning discussion, blended and online learning discussion. With that, colleagues, a lot of thanks I'm seeing within the chats. With that, colleagues, thank you very much for your presence. Prof Danforth, thank you very much for your introduction as well as your engagement. Thank you, colleagues, for your time as well. Prof Laura, I could not have asked for a better talk. Thank you very much. I hope we will see each other in the next session. Goodbye, colleagues.
Thank you very much for the invitation and good luck.